The Mafia controlled the world. Or at least it came very close to doing so in the 1920s and 30s. Even though they didn't take over Washington, D.C., they ended up controlling the White House, and even had the President of the United States in their pocket. This is the story of how the Mafia almost took over America, and what would have happened if they had succeeded. If you think about what we know about the Mafia, it's mostly that they were involved in things like organized crime, illegal gambling, prostitution, and selling drugs. But there was more to them than that. One of the main ways that they made money, especially during the 1920s, was through bootlegging, which is selling alcohol illegally. The reason why they were able to do this is because after World War I, a law called the Volstead Act banned the sale, production, and transportation of alcohol across the United States. The Mafia, however, didn't care too much about laws, and they began to sell alcohol illegally. And since they were already making a ton of money from other criminal activities, they were able to bribe police officers and politicians to turn a blind eye to what they were doing. And since these politicians were getting paid off by the Mafia, they weren't going to be the ones to go out of their way to arrest the criminals. So this gave the Mafia a lot of power within the government. But it wasn't until the 1930s that the Mafia realized just how powerful they actually were. At the start of the decade, they were mainly only powerful in certain cities, but by the end of it, they were essentially running the entire country. And it all started with the presidential election of 1932. The sitting president was Herbert Hoover, who had been elected in 1928. He was a Republican, which meant that the Democrats were looking to take back the White House, but they didn't have any obvious candidates to run for president. That was until Franklin D. Roosevelt entered the picture. Roosevelt was someone that had worked his way up through the ranks of the Democratic Party, and he seemed like he had a pretty good shot at beating Hoover. However, many people were skeptical of him, because he was the same kind of politician that had been in office when the Great Depression hit. So in order to get elected, Roosevelt needed to convince Americans that he could help them recover from the economic crash. And what better way to do that than by promising to end prohibition? Now, even though ending prohibition wouldn't directly help people financially, it would free up a lot of money that was being spent on illegal alcohol. And the person who benefited the most from this was, of course, the Mafia. So they threw their full support behind Roosevelt and helped him win the election. Now, once he was elected, the Mafia thought that they had a great relationship with the new president. They were wrong. As soon as Roosevelt was inaugurated, he began to crack down on organized crime. This agency would go after mobsters and try to bring them to justice. And the director of this new FBI was none other than J. Edgar Hoover, who would become one of the most hated men by the Mafia. Even though the FBI was set up to go after the mob, it would have been possible without the help of the Treasury Department, newly established. Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Division, also known as the T-Men. These guys went after bootleggers and other criminals who were selling alcohol illegally. But the thing is, they weren't exactly an official law enforcement agency. They were technically Treasury agents, which meant that they didn't have to follow the same rules as cops and could basically do whatever they wanted. They could arrest people without warrants, plant evidence, and even beat suspects without having to face consequences. So they were a pretty scary bunch, especially when you consider that they were armed to the teeth. And if that wasn't enough, the Treasury Department also hired a man named Harry Anslinger to head up the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics. His job was to go after all the major drug dealers and essentially end the drug trade in America. With all of these groups going after them, the Mafia didn't stand a chance. And before long, many of their top earners were either arrested or dead. For example, in 1931, the leader of one of the most powerful families in the Mafia, Joseph Masseria, was killed in a hit ordered by his rival, Charles Luciano. A couple years later, Luciano himself was arrested and sent to prison, where he would stay for 50 years. Another big fish that was caught was Waxy Gordon, who was a bootlegger and owned a bunch of illegal casinos. In 1934, he was arrested for tax evasion and sentenced to serve 18 months in prison. And lastly, there was Babyface Nelson, who was one of the most notorious gangsters of all time. He was killed in a shootout with police officers in 1934 after a bank robbery. With all of these threats to their way of life, the Mafia decided to call a truce and try to work something out with the government. They wanted to continue making money through bootlegging and other criminal activities. They were willing to pay a fee to the federal government in exchange for not getting arrested. And the man who brokered this deal was none other than Harry Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He agreed to look the other way, as long as the Mafia paid him and the other federal agents a hefty sum of money every month. And this is where things got really crazy, because it turned out that Anslinger was pocketing millions of dollars that should have been going to the Treasury Department. When this was discovered, he was fired and went to prison, where he served 3 years. But the damage had already been done. With Anslinger gone, the Mafia no longer had anyone keeping the feds at bay, and they were arrested en masse. Thousands of mobsters were sent to jail, and the Mafia families lost millions of dollars. It was at this point that the government decided to go after the Mafia's assets and try to seize everything they had illegally obtained. This included their businesses, their property, and even their family heirlooms. Over the next few years, the Mafia lost billions of dollars worth of property and were left with nothing. Now, if this had happened in our timeline, it would have been the end of the Mafia as we know it. But there was another path that things could have taken us down. What if the Mafia had actually taken over the United States? Well, the first thing they would have done is legalized alcohol again. After all, that was the main way that they were making money. And this would have caused a bunch of problems. First of all, it would have led to a whole new generation of alcoholics, since kids would be able to buy booze whenever they wanted. Secondly, it would have led to an increase in violent crime, since people would be more likely to get drunk and then act out. And thirdly, it would have led to a bunch of new Mafia families being formed, since anyone who wanted to make a quick buck would be able to get into the bootlegging business. After the US became illegal, the Mafia would have moved on to other things like controlling the unions and infiltrating the government. They would have done this by bribing politicians and judges and by threatening anyone who got in their way. Before long, they would have complete control of the country and could do whatever they wanted. They might have even tried to make America into a dictatorship where only mobsters were allowed to hold political office. Or maybe they would have kept things the same but pocketed the tax revenue that was previously going to the government. Either way, it wouldn't have been good for the average American. It's a good thing that didn't happen. But what would you have done if you were running the country? Let me know in the comments below. Also, make sure to vote for the next topic. And as always, thanks for watching.